Everyone, salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we are going to talk about intergenerational dilemmas of Muslim women in India. And the speaker is Professor Huma Ahmed-Ghosh, who is a professor emeriti, right, in the Department of Women's Studies, San Diego State University. And she will be formally introduced by Professor Shailja Sharma, who is joining from Berlin right now. She's a professor and chair of international studies and co-director at DePaul Migration Collaborative in Chicago. So welcome you all. And now I invite Shailja Sharma-ji for the formal introductory remarks. And later on, she will be the one who will be doing the concluding remarks. So welcome you all. Thank you. Oh, okay, Shailja Sharma-ji.
Hello,
muted.
hello everybody. Okay.
Rafa, take out the slide, please. Thank you.
I shouldn't be muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You are fine. Yes.
Okay. So I'm very, very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Huma Ahmed-Ghosh, whom I got to know during her Fulbright work in India for this project that she's going to be talking about today. Dr. Huma Ahmed-Ghosh is a professor emeritus at the Department of Women's Studies in San Diego State University. She received her PhD in 1999 in cultural anthropology from Syracuse and had done her MA and MPhil from the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University before that, and her BA in economics from Delhi University. So you can see that she is educated in a wide variety of disciplines. Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh has published extensively on women in Afghanistan, on Muslim women in India and in the US diaspora, and has done a lot of work on gendered violence and conflict in Afghanistan. She has published 2 edited books entitled Contesting Feminisms, Gender and Islam in Asia, and Asian Muslim Women, Globalization and Local Realities. As I mentioned before, she was a senior scholar in the Fulbright program. And she's also an activist who has engaged with community development in San Diego, working on gendered issues within refugee communities. In 2023, Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame in San Diego for her community service and her teaching in the same city. Her teaching, research, and activist issues are centered on social justice for minorities, with a focus on Muslim communities. Since her recent retirement, Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh has founded an organization to teach English to newly arrived Afghan refugees in San Diego. But today we'll be talking about her project in India, and I invite you all to hear some of the results of her research. Thank you.
Humaji.
Ji. Okay, firstly, I want to thank everybody who's here today. With a quick look of the people, I am really, really grateful to friends and relatives who are logging on from all over the world, India, England, Canada, and the US. And of course, I do want to say it is indeed an honor to be here today. A very big thank you to Dr. Raziuddin for this invitation to speak on this amazing forum. And to Shailja Sharma, who is, I know just now, with a student in an emergency in the hospital in Berlin. This is the other life of professors, but is graciously trying to be on line and on track with this talk today. I also want to do a quick shout out to Dr. Rohini Ray, a very, very newly minted PhD recipient in economics from UCSD, who taught Huma auntie to navigate AI in preparation of this talk. I want to introduce myself a bit over here, especially when talking about intergenerational issues. Only our generation can do this because we have seen many generations. Like most seniors, we have seen the world evolve and devolve, progress and regress, and by my age, become quite opinionated about things. In the so-called objectivity of academia and the rigors of thorough scholarship, my professional experiences over the last almost 4 decades, have been a roller coaster ride, working on gender, Islam, and numerous other issues related to women in society, especially in India, Afghanistan, and the US. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology with an emphasis in women's studies. So my research and analysis is informed by ethnographic research, which is by talking to people, and feminism, which is really research on women and has nothing to do with man-hating. Almost a decade ago, in 2015, I published 2 edited volumes on gender and Islam, as Shailaja pointed out. Each essay in these books basically speaks to Muslim women's struggles to claim agencies and rights within their countries as dictated by regional, historical, political, and social institutions that lead to constantly shifting cultural values and prescriptions. Insights derived from these essays in these volumes, because they spanned almost every country in Asia, inspired me to engage in ethnographic research in India to better understand the lived realities of young Muslim women. The attempt here is to deconstruct young Muslim women's discourses on issues that directly affect their lives under their current global and local socio-political realities. I want to hear about everyday lives of young Muslim women and their mothers and give voice to their multiple realities and locate the analysis at the intersectionality of numerous layered identities. I am totally aware of the differences in perceptions of Islam and varying perspectives based on the location of the interviewees, their ethnicity, social class, the generation of conversion to Islam, the education level, and also the rural-urban divide, etc., that really impacts their understanding of their own reality. What I will discuss today is reflective of the women I interviewed and may not resonate with the experiences of every single Muslim woman in India. All my previous work has emphasized the heterogeneity amongst Muslims. There's a very big danger in homogenizing all Muslims. Firstly, based on the Western stereotypes that have been politically problematic since the Crusades, and even more so in the recent decades. And 2, also homogenizing is dangerous because there is a political motivation by extremist mullahs and Salafi Saudis who want to exercise political and cultural control over all Muslims globally. So therefore, I am very cautious about homogenizing Muslims because it is not a possibility. I do want to spend some time discussing this topic of intergenerational. Because whatever intergeneration exists amongst Muslims in India, and especially Muslim women today, is grounded in each generation's lived experiences of that era. To put it simply, and at the risk of generalizing, referring only to Muslims in India, one can broadly divide the current generations in India, not just age-wise, but through their experiences in a Hindu majority country as being defined by 4 major events that not only decided their fate in India, but also reciprocally created an awareness among non-Muslims in India about their religion, lifestyle, culture, and position in India as legitimate or illegitimate Indian citizens. These 4 events are partition, 1947, the Shah Bano case, 1985, Babri Masjid demolition, 1992, the Gujarat pogrom, 2002, and on the ongoing Citizenship Amendment Bill and its byproduct, the Shaheen Bagh protest in Delhi of 2019. Most of these events impacted and were protested differently by Muslim women and Muslim men, and each event introduced a new set of awareness to different generations of Muslims, and not just Muslims, but also Hindus about Muslims in India. Talking about partition, and some of it, all of you are very, very familiar, but I just want to frame it in the context of this talk. So partition of in India in 1947, this was the most traumatic event that tore apart one nation into two in one of the bloodiest encounters of modern era based on religion. Of course, besides Nazi Germany and today Palestine and Israel, and of course, there are many others too. This event called into loyalties of nationhood for the individual based on their religious affinity. It was one of the first instances of the conflation of one's loyalty to the nation over one's religion, and still perceived by many Hindus as a reason for discrimination, resentment, and exclusion of Muslims from Indian citizenship. Muslims who chose to stay in India prioritized their legitimate rights to Indian citizenship and participated in India's development to the same extent as non-Muslims. For that generation of Muslims in India, especially Muslim women, education and assimilation to a modernizing India was prioritized, especially in certain classes, leading to a more secular Muslim community than we see now. On a personal note, my maternal grand aunts were the first women professors in Aligarh Muslim University and Bhopal University, as well as the first women students to graduate from Aligarh Muslim University. Their names, may their souls rest in peace, Hamida Salim and Safia Akhtar. The second event which tested Muslim and Hindu loyalty to the nation and to each other, I just want to say something I forgot to put in the first, is because of partition, the divisions between Hindus and Muslims became more marked, and it was reflected most publicly in the discussions that started with the Muslim personal law and the Hindu Code Bill, and the beginnings of a discussion on the Uniform Civil Code. The second event which tested Muslim and Hindu loyalty to the nation and to each other was the Shah Bano case of 1985. This case was about a 70-year-old woman demanding alimony from her divorced husband under the civil family laws, and was granted this right by the Supreme Court, which were contested by her ex-husband under the Muslim personal law. This case did not create animosity amongst Hindus and Muslims in visible ways, but for a generation of non-Muslims was the first exposure to Muslim customs and traditions that to them seemed archaic and backward. It was a generation of Indians who knew very little about lives of Muslims, and this opened their eyes to differences between the two communities and gave the non-Muslims, the Hindus mainly, a moral superiority, because the Hindu Code Bill, which was passed in 1958, to them seemed, and it was, more liberal than the Muslim personal law. What this event do was split the Muslim community in India, though, not just by class, but also by gender. It was the first incident amongst the Muslim community where at the national level and in very local ways, so-called modern, liberal and secular-minded Muslim women and scholars questioned the Muslim personal laws and the gender inequalities that it harbored. And it also, they tried to protest, it harbored, and also they protested the justification and protection of these laws by more traditional Muslims. Unfortunately, the Congress party, in its attempt to placate and appease the Muslim community, sided with the conservatives and passed a very problematic bill in 1986, which is referred to as the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act. I bring this up because the Muslim personal law has been a very contentious issue for many Muslim women and exploited by both the Hindu right-wing government and Muslim fundamentalists to play out their politics by using and controlling Muslim women. We'll talk more about this later in this talk today. And again, on a personal note, what I would refer to as the second generation, because the partition was the first, just for the purpose of this talk. On a personal note, the second generation, which would then be my mother, received death threats after writing in a women's magazine called Femina in support of Shah Banu, leading us to stay indoors with security in a predominantly Muslim neighborhood in Delhi. 1992 was what I would call the first dark period in post-independent India that brought to the fore India's divided nation along religious lines. Animosity between Hindus and Muslims were being created and fanned by the BJP in no uncertain and very aggressive ways by the 1980s, culminating in a huge Rath Yatra by Shri L.K. Advani, at that time a prominent BJP leader. He succeeded in creating a frenzy that led to over 1,500 Hindus to congregate in Ayodhya and demolish the 16th century mosque in Ayodhya. And you guys know what has happened now. It's been replaced by a fantastical Ram Mandir. Violence against Muslims erupted for a few months across India, with approximately 2,000 people being killed, majority of them Muslim. This was the beginning of the end. 1993 saw a retaliatory terrorist attack in Mumbai by Muslim terrorists. This sealed the permanent divide between the two communities, where terrorism became synonymous with Muslims and the call for a Hindu nation reverberated with the majority of the Hindus. Now steps in a third generation of Muslims who, in reaction to this desecration and ensuing violence by the majority community, react by withdrawing from the mainstream, ghettoizing, re-traditionalizing their values and actions based on Islam. And this is what was very visible on my trips back to India in the 1990s and 2000s. The stirrings of Islamization on the family and community front were palpable. School children are recognizing religious differences at an early age and questioning and bullying Muslim children. Parents are becoming anxious about theirs and their children's future in this new Hindutva-oriented India, and reorienting their children's upbringing by instilling Islamic values and other forms of Islamism. On a personal note, I mainly, straddling the second and third generation, observed certain insertions in daily lives of my Muslim friends, contemporaries, and family members that did not exist while I was growing up in India at that time. This generation of mothers, for example, started a birthday party for their children with a Fatiha, which is a recitation of Quranic blessing. And it would always end up with happy birthday singing and, you know, what used to always happen. But the consciousness had increased. The Muslim mothers became very wary of letting their children play with non-Muslim friends, focused more on their daughters' clothing, the eternal curse for all women, and adopting a new role as inculcators and transmitters of a newly emerging culture that they themselves had not been brought up in. Mothering was now a communal act. Namaz was being observed and fasting introduced. For this generation of Muslims, the Gujarat program of 2002 further strengthened their belief in isolationism and fervor to practice their faith. 10 years later, by 2013-14, the rise of Hindutva, the call for anti-Muslim and other minorities stands at the national and local levels became the clarion call for the BJP. And it sealed the acrimonious divide between Hindus and Muslims. This divide was further reflected in the passing of the controversial bill, the Citizen Amendment Bill of 2019, that basically threatened to and did nullify citizenships of many Muslims in India and alienated many others who saw themselves as Indian now feeling vulnerable, scared, and besieged. This led to a major sit-in and protest in December of 2019, which lasted a few months, mainly by Muslim women in a neighborhood in Delhi called Shaheen Bagh, who feared, basically the women were there because they feared for their children's future. And when I talked to them, I was in Delhi at that time and living in that neighborhood, these women, it was very fascinating. They had never left their homes. They were never seen in public, but they were very, very scared for their children and told me that we will die. We are old, but what are they going to do to our children here? This protest blocked the main road between Delhi and one of its suburbs called Noida, basically disrupting daily life socially and economically for the region. This protest consisted of all kinds of men and women, mainly women from different social classes, different age groups. And this was recognized and advertised nationally, internationally, and gained support nationally and internationally. So given this background, I now want to move to the younger generation to locate them in their livelihoods, in their historical setting, really post Babri Masjid. So when I went to India to do Fulbright research now 5 years ago, because I had been observing a higher level of Islamization amongst my social class and others, I was curious to see how the younger generation were reacting to the Modi government starting 2014. So I wanted to interview young women who were born on or around Babri Masjid to see what their socialization was into adulthood. So I interviewed students in their late teens, early 20s, and young professionals in their early 30s, I mean. So when I went out to do my research, I call them the fourth generation. I found that they, in their own ways, took upon themselves the responsibility to represent the newly emerging Muslim Islamic community on the global stage. The three main issues that separate young Muslim women and their mothers and grandmothers revolve around their, their sense of being part of a global community, not just national or local, but a global community. And the prime reason for it is the impact of social media. And while doing my research for this paper, I came across many PhD dissertations and writings by young Muslims, even in this country, who went back to India to do their research, and in India, talking about their generation. And the thesis was basically an analysis of social media. So the role of social media in their lives seems to trump, and sorry to use that word, it has multiple meanings now, but I have to find a better word. There are other kinds of local connections. So how has access to internet, social media, and other technologies shaped their thinking and sense of self as a minority in the current era of Islamophobia was one of the questions I asked. And also I noticed that their determination to achieve economic independence was very high despite the perceived discrimination. Education, especially higher education, was seen by many of them as desirable to establish that independence. And I will talk a bit more, or maybe I'll forget to do that if it gets too long, is there was a very strong sense amongst the younger Muslim women of economic independence and higher education independent of being married. That was interesting. You know, even though they talked about getting married and having children and whatnot, some of them were not even keen on doing that. But economic independence was their prime interest. And then there was also the definite interest in reform of the Muslim personal law, which was at odds with their mothers and grandmothers to some extent. So how do young Muslim women's faith relate to their selfhoods? To what extent have varying family laws and the cultural environment of a Hindutva India led to perceptions of their selfhood? And I bring this up a couple of times because it seemed through these generations that I have talked about that the identity of most Muslims in India is in reaction to how they are perceived by the majority community. So at some level, it's contrary, it's a reactionary, it's trying to explain themselves as a minority and an internalized sense of the responsibility to do that for the majority. So it's with the younger generation, this feeling was also very strong because by their generation, by now, the last decade or two, they have felt that they are being battered. So a lot of their thinking, their actions, or the creation of a kind of self-identity that they talk about is rooted in the sense of being seen as an outsider in their own country. And therefore, this generation was more interesting for me to talk to because I felt that I grew up in a very, very different India than these people are. So it was very eye-opening for me to see their responses. The research questions, therefore, were based in the need to further understand their identities. In what ways do their understandings of Islam either exacerbate the conflicts or resolve them? These dilemmas mainly exist because of the politicization of not just Islam, but also secularism. In an attempt to address this, I examined women's agency not only through their decisions to engage actively with their faith, but also through the strategies these women might employ to express their individual identities and relationships that may or may not contradict their commitment to the faith. Young Muslim women tussle with their perception of Islam and how their contribution to the faith as participants and enforcers through their diverse status markers empower them. So this research basically that I did spoke to the complexity of young Muslim women's roles in India and challenged the neat compartments and distinct theorizations. So I have time, yeah? Yeah. Recent decades have seen a rapid increase in discussion on Muslims in India and the Western diaspora and in states with substantial minority populations. Simultaneously, this period has also witnessed a dramatic increase on research on Muslim women's status in order to better understand their lives, but also in the West to talk about the whole global Muslim community in ways that are putting Muslims down as a community. So the using of women, Muslim women, for Western interests. And at some level, there seems to be a sense of Islamic identity that is more commonly shared among Muslims today than in any other historical period. Simultaneously, Muslims wrestle with their identities in their national and local sociopolitical environments. The added layer of complexity involves negotiations with majority communities in terms of how they are being perceived as different and by the minority community and how they perceive themselves as being seen differently, as I just elaborated upon. Much has been written and debated about women's rights in Muslim countries by Western and so-called Islamic feminists, where Western and Islamic feminists and other scholars themselves are divided on the best practices approach to empower and define Muslim women. Islamic feminists, including Mir Hosseini, Rifat Hassan, and many, many others, contest the fundamentalist reading of the Quran to claim rights for women within the faith. But the prevalence of Sharia law in secular states would challenge the demand for women's rights and complicate legal discourses in many countries. And I make a special point here because the legal rights for everybody, especially for women and minority women in secular states, require a very different approach of understanding and analysis than Islamic rights based in Islam in theocratic states. So for India and Indians, this is a problem because we see it as a secular state. Competing laws such as colonial, customary, Islamic, and varied civil laws grounded in competing agendas of the state and other vested interest groups have been most evident in the arena of family laws with varying impacts on women. Often the secular and religious rely on each other to reinforce gender norms. I hope to highlight the contradictions of legal pluralism by untangling some of the dilemmas and complexities that these systems pose for young Muslim women's gendered identities in India, especially through their voices and their oral histories, expressing their desires and identities as minorities in the larger society. This talk is focusing on the plurality of young Indian women's experiences and is interested in how college-going Muslim women students envision their gendered identities as they attain selfhood in individual and collective terms. An individual as separate from the collective, separate from their families and previous generations, basically grounded in communities that they find online. And the collective terms is not so much necessarily their family members or the community of the seniors, but their own age group and cohort, which is connected through colleges, their workplace, and again, social media. So I was interested in understanding how they see the family laws impact their minority status. I conducted research in New Delhi and in Goa to do a comparative analysis of the above mentioned issues because of the differences in the two states in terms of Muslim personal laws. Muslims in Delhi, like most of the country, are expected to conform to the Muslim personal law. Goa is an exception because Goa is the only state that has a uniform civil code that historically was based on the Portuguese laws. So when I talked to the Muslims in Goa, topics of triple talaq, etc., which was a hot topic 5 years ago, was not of any concern because they felt that they were the liberal Muslims and their issues were very different, which I will not talk about here just now because that's for another time. So therefore, I was interested in these women to see if they were re-traditionalizing their lives by picking and adopting certain parts of Islam that suited them, or was there a resistance to certain traditional norms? Coming to social media, while most existing generations have adapted to rapidly changing technologies and engaged to varying extents with social media, I was just told last night that it's only my generation that does Facebook now. But I am very committed to Facebook and not interested in moving on. But the savviness and the speed and the total trust with which the younger generation engaged today is unmatched compared to any other era. Young Muslim women, as others in their cohort, are resorting to social media for global networking to frame and analyze their narratives within this context and the emerging global cultures of diverse feminisms. On the one hand, stereotypes abound whenever Muslims are represented in media, as has been pointed out by many scholars in previous decades. Men are depicted as bearded, capped, flinging themselves down collectively towards Mecca, and women are always veiled to varying degrees. Reductively, the diversity of Islam has been subsumed into an identity endowed primarily with negative attributes, and today find their continuation in a catchword, fundamentalism. All of you are familiar with media representations of Muslims over the past few decades, so we'll not elaborate on it. What has changed for the younger generation of Muslims is their reliance on social media versus print and film media to better understand themselves. And this has led to a globalized, idealized image to which to conform to. Tabassum Khan, who is now a young professor in the US, in her research in Delhi, points out that while there is spatial segregation of Muslim and Hindu communities, more and more we are seeing that, and limited mobility maybe for some women in some areas, access to the world through social media is increasing. Internet connectivity presented many more avenues for self-expression to the youth than was probably foreseen by their parents. They could stay in the community and yet be connected to the world. They could be created, befriend whoever they wanted, etc. For the women I interviewed, their sense of being Muslim was deeply rooted in social media messaging. They subscribed to platforms that gave them a sense of empowerment. Education and economic independence was emphasized in these sites. They were part of discussion groups on Islamic feminism, sexuality issues, religious advice, and quite commonly in groups that discussed Islamic fashions and cosmetics. You get halal cosmetics, in case you didn't know that, nail polish, etc., and all that. You're never too old to learn new things. Women's religious groups discussing the Quran was another popular site they accessed. Sabah Mahmood, in her seminal work, Politics of Piety, published in 2005, has been inspirational to young Muslim women. Her research is on Egyptian women meeting in mosques to discuss Muslim morality as embedded in religion and also critiques of secularism. Basically, Mahmood redefines women's agency through their choice of being religious and moral, and this resonates very strongly with young Muslim women in India today. Another inspiration for these young women is Amina Wadood. Amina Wadood's work, actions and writings. These young women found an affirmation for their faith, which they wanted to practice on an equal footing with men. Wadood's bold step in 2005 to lead Friday prayers in New York resonated with these young women who want to access public spaces and the mosque on the same footing as men. Today, I will elaborate on this hijab as a signifier of women's piety and religiosity, a deliberate attempt on their part to be seen as Muslim. Discussing the hijab is fraught with complications, controversies, and is very nuanced. To be discussed in a few minutes is hard, but I will try to highlight some of the responses from the interviewees. At another level, I usually try to stay away from a discussion on the hijab because it has come to symbolize a soul marker for women's identity, and identity that for non-Muslims globally and especially in the West is layered with oppression and backwardness. At another level, I also feel that with the hijab and with the discussion on women's clothing through history and globally, I like to use a phrase I've used in my previous writings, is that women's bodies are seen as globalized property on which are contested masculinities of nations. So in my work on Afghanistan that I've published, I write about how the big discussion for a few decades now has been on the burqa in Afghanistan, which has been imposed by the Taliban, and how Western feminists also talk about it as not just oppression, which it is at that level, and depending on who's doing it and how many choices you really have, is to show that Islam as a whole is a backward religion, because in the West, we allow women to wear what they want. So how nationhood and competing masculinities really use women and women's bodies to talk about themselves. And so I did talk about 15 years ago, which was titled, to make it sensational because it was to high school students, I titled it From Burqa to Bikini, and then went on and on. And so I got quite a large audience because of that. But that aside, this is an issue that is very fraught with complexities. So I want to clarify my position on why I avoid the hijab, but I will talk about it because it was central to some of the women I was interviewing. There has been in the past 25 years a very observable increase in young women resorting to the hijab. This, in some cases, is in contrast to their mothers who are not wearing the hijab. For most Muslim students that I interviewed, I came across a range of responses to why they started wearing the hijab as they grew up. And the reasons ranged from, starting with the first one, my family told me to do so. Traditionally, headscarving to some extent has been practiced by Muslim women in some families. While girls are not required to do so in high school or college, they are expected to observe certain level of parda after marriage or when visiting Muslim relatives as adults. There now seems to be a push by these family members to insist on earlier head covering, starting with high school and college. These women did affirm that they would not have worn it if it was entirely their individual decision. Where there was family pressure to wear it, they would be the only student wearing it in school and did feel awkward. It marked them as Muslim, which in many cases marked them as the enemy. Another reason was Islam tells us to wear the hijab, and I simply want to obey my religion. This response was more prevalent among young women whose mothers were not hijabi. They have either read the Quran or heard it from their friends and relatives. In college, they have joined religion-based groups and see the need to conform to their faith. They said, wearing a hijab gives me a better public reputation. This is where they mentioned the urgency and comfort with a sense of community, where they also mentioned that they were now outsiders in India, and so they needed to seek out a community. Seeking protection from the majority community was stated as one of the main reasons to conform to their faith. Another set of students said, many of my friends wear it and I want to be part of the group. And so similarly to the previous point, but they were very conscious to not try it out because there was this strong sense that once you started wearing it, removing it would mean that you had a weakness of faith in Islam. A couple of them said, I seek to affirm my Muslim identity and to show I am different from non-Muslims. They had a sense of pride, and this response referred to being identified as Muslim from a young age. They said that that when they were in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade around that time, the consciousness of being different arose amongst their friends. Questions were asked about their faith, especially what they ate, and about whether their mothers wore the burqa. And they felt that all of these were coming from family members of non-Muslims, because why would the child sitting next to them in the class in the 4th grade ask these questions? And so at that age, the differences started creeping in. And so they sought out other Muslims in school to befriend. A couple of others, especially the graduate students that I interviewed, said, I want to make a statement against Western consumer culture. And they seem to have a more sophisticated sense of capitalism, Western objectification of women, and thus chose to wear the hijab and be modest. And they continued, some of them, that I am bothered by the attention male students will give me. Therefore, they claimed that men did not flirt with them or tease because they are covered. In fact, they got more respect from them. This put a smile on my face, because while I was hanging around Jamia University in Delhi and Aligarh Muslim University in Aligarh, the flirting was very visible while they were headscarved, and I thought that was very cute and normal and natural. And then some of them said, simply because I find it nice and fashionable. And these young women were very stylish in their hijabs, and they were following designs and styles of wearing the hijab from YouTube and TikTok, which, by the way, TikTok is running their lives, and felt that, you know, it was fashionable. Another set of students said that they wear the hijab and the abaya because of their limited clothing, and they could have a simpler lifestyle because they were covered. So it was interesting, and some of them, only half of them, could point to me where in the Quran it says that you should cover yourself. So it was interesting from where the messaging was coming. But what was definitely a commonality is that they did identify the hijab with Islam, and their sense of being Muslim and wanting to, and did show the confidence to do so in a society which they realized and is true was very anti-Muslim. So I also became very conscious, by the way, as a researcher of my, and I'm going to say it, privileged position as a researcher and who I am through my class education, etc., because I found that I was being drawn to the hijabi women to talk about the lives of young Muslim women, and quickly corrected my course and interviewed other Muslim families and girls who were not hijabi and yet identified as Muslims. And their responses were very varied too. One set of non-headscarf young women said, my family members have never covered their heads except maybe my grandmother, who lightly wore a dupatta, a shawl on her head. Women in their families for generations were also college educated and professional. Some of them said, we identify as Muslims, but do not follow the faith ritualistically. My faith is part of my life, so I do not have to wear it on my sleeve/head. I do not want to bring attention, and some said, I do not want to bring attention to myself as a Muslim in a Hindu majority country, because professionally, I do not want to jeopardize my job possibilities. Some of them want to marry a Muslim man who respects and values me and does not get scared of my hijab. And this was a very long, open discussion when it came to who you want to marry, because some of them felt that their families and other families were identifying them solely in terms of the hijab and were getting proposals for them from very conservative men, whereas they wanted to marry more liberal Muslim men. And I said, this is a big dilemma. If you're going to walk around with a hijab, then these are the signals that are being sent out. In most cases, the non-hijabi mothers' reaction to their hijabi daughters ranged from disbelief, discomfort, and puzzlement to pride in their daughters' decisions. They claimed the frame of reference has to do with the acceptance of the reality of change. This has to do with the fact that there no longer exists a monolith Islam, if there ever was. Even though social media may create a sense of oneness for groups of women and the youth at a spiritual level. For young Muslim women, this becomes problematic. Should they defend it as a monolith religion or not? And the cultural upbringing is very Indian, and so that separated them from the Muslims on social media who were from the Middle East. Briefly about the Muslim personal law, this is where the maximum discussion was, and I'm going to rush through it now, is that they were not for the uniform civil code. They were not interested in that, but they thought that and felt that the Muslim personal law needs drastic changes. They could not imagine being part of, as one of them said, a menagerie of 4 wives. They could not imagine being told how to behave. Even though headscarf, they did not believe in gender segregation, and they wanted equal rights with men in matters of property, choice of marriage partner, access to education and employment. Interestingly, 68% of women thought sexuality was a personal matter and should not be a reason for discrimination. I was very surprised. It was the first generation that talked so openly about sexuality. And when I did bring it up with the mothers, it was always, the topic was changed within minutes. The Jamia Queer Collective was very visible on campus with posters declaring Mohabbat Azad hai, love is free. Two of my interviewees were gay and did feel discriminated against, but claimed that this is how Allah made them, so they were not ashamed of their queerness. This was another instance where social media played a very, very important role in their lives, because they could connect with similar people and groups to feel empowered and normal. In both cases, the mothers were aware of their sexuality, but had not informed the fathers or other relatives for fears of retaliation and ostracization. We enjoyed talking about Ismat Chughai's Lihaf, the quilt, over a cup of coffee at Cafe Coffee in Delhi. So through this research and the background that I have given, I was made aware of the heterogeneity of Muslims and the intergenerational changes where there is a stronger sense of being Muslim and following Islamic ways amongst the younger generation that may have ever, across class lines, that may have ever existed in India. So it's a multi-pronged analysis here and an approach to understanding feminism and the ground reality of women's lives. I want to conclude now that, because I want to open it up to questions, but I do want to say that towards the end of my research, I was also very curious to get the Hindu students' perspectives on their classmates, their fellow men. And so I asked them, because even though Jamia is seen as a Muslim majority university, majority of the students, if not more than 50%, are non-Muslims. And so in the department of especially women's studies, the majority were definitely non-Muslims. And when I asked them that what their family's reaction was to them studying at Jamia University, they all of them said that their families resisted it. They were hesitant. And the reasons that their families gave was the fear that they would be trapped into marrying a Muslim man, the love jihad, which I hold the flag very proudly. And the second was that biryani ke naam pe beef khilayenge. So in the name of feeding biryani, they will feed beef to these Hindu girls. And that because the degrees are from Jamia, they will not get jobs. So with these things, it was interesting. And when I talked to the mothers, so three of them said their mothers wouldn't mind talking to me. I asked them these questions, and the responses were extremely disturbing. All mothers grew up pre-92, and with Babri Masjid, Gujarat, and the recent things going on, there's no point talking about the disturbing responses I got, because all of you are very familiar with them. But they had a sense of self-righteousness that they were protecting their daughters in a very tumultuous era. And so sending their daughters to a Muslim ghetto, which breeds terrorism. I think some of you are familiar with the film that came out some time back on, forgetting the name of the film, that they were really, really nervous. And some of them, their fathers would drop the students and bring them back. When I talked to some non-Muslim male students, their families did not resist, because they were they thought, and I didn't get to talk to their mothers, but when I asked these boys about their relationship with their students, they did have a very secular perspective. Most of their friends were Muslims, men and women, and headscarved women. And when I approached them about the options of maybe marrying one of them or not, they giggled. So I said, why are you giggling? You're not saying a yes or a no. And some of them said they'll marry whoever their parents tell them. That was the out for this question. And some of them said, no, they're very open to it, even though they may be family protests. So it was interesting to see how gendered these discourses were. And when I talked to some of the Muslim male students on campus, they did come across to me as being much more conservative than the Muslim women on campus. And they did feel that when it came to marriage, they would marry more traditional Muslim women. Given that on campus, they were hanging out with a lot of women friends and all of that. But the Muslim women were not that sure they would marry a conservative Muslim man, even though if she was headscarved, because of a certain level of feminism that has crept in. And I want to say a sense of empowerment that they can live on their own and succeed. So on this note, I'd like to end this talk.
Wonderful talk. Let's hear Dr. Shailja Sharma for the concluding remarks, and after that we will go into the question and answer session. Shailja ji.
Ji, thank you so much. Huma, it's I have been I have had many conversations with you about your project, but it's still fascinating for me to hear, your presentation, which is bringing in a lot of complicated topics. I'm going to just maybe bring up like a couple of questions / remarks about specific points in your paper / research, where I think I'm going to try and, push back just a little bit to ask you to go a little deeper. And the first point that I want to bring up is, in your introduction, you said, that you were against the homogenizing of Muslims because this homogenizing is based on Western stereotypes or, very extremist sort of Salafi kind of thinking. So one question I had was, even though both Western thinking of a certain type and extremist Islamist thinking, seeks to homogenize Muslims, there is a third sort of group that tries to homogenize Muslims, especially in India, which is the whole discourse coming out of various Hindutva Vadis and, their fellow travelers, which lumps Muslims together just on the basis of religion. And not even of belief, right? So they're not even questioning the distinction between religion and belief, but just assuming that everyone from a certain religion believes the same things. Whereas, as your research, has found out that people believe a range of things. They don't just believe one thing. So my question is it important to distinguish among the different relationships that Muslims have with Islam and with their identities as a reaction to this lumping together, right? In other words, do Muslims have different reactions to their relationship to Islam depending on who is asking them, right? So that is sort of one question that I want to put out there. The second question actually, or the second point that I found very interesting, again, is trying to sort of disentangle the ways in which international political Islam works to fashion identities of Muslims in different countries versus the kinds of identities that are coming out within a national framework. So, for example, part of the whole debate about who gets to wear hijab versus who doesn't choose to wear hijab is also coming in this age of social media from a very international, internationalist idea of what Islam is, right? It may not be indigenous to Indian Muslims. It might be coming, for example, from solidarity with Palestinians or something like that. So, I thought that was very interesting that as a minority within a country, you might take one political stance, but then as part of a global group, you might take another kind of stance vis-a-vis visible markers of religious identity. And the last thing I guess I'll end with, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, is to what extent is the emphasis on, wearing hijab and displaying obvious sort of symbols of identity any different from the way in which, we have seen this mainstreaming of religiosity in India as well, among Hindus, among Sikhs, among, other groups. So there is a way in which, Hindus wearing the red thread, or, tikkas, or other, Om symbols or something like that. That has become much more common also. And I'm wondering if some of these choices that women you interviewed made is also just like a response to that, as opposed to something to do with inherent belief. So I'll stop there and give you a chance to maybe, answer whichever parts of this feels relevant to you.
Thank you very much. Just we will go to the question answer, but before that, Rafat, can you show the coming Saturday's session?
First time showing you the Sunday one tomorrow.
Sorry, sorry, we forgot this is a special session that is for tomorrow. We usually don't do on Sunday, but because of the very much, desire to hear from the experts, we have Professor Aditya Mukherjee, his wife Mridula Mukherjee, Professor Zoya Hassan, all from JNU, and then Dr. Hilal Ahmed from CSDS, and Sangeeta Barua from WIRE. So these are the experts who are going to talk on dissecting India's stunning election outcome, what challenges lie ahead. This is tomorrow, same time, same Zoom link, no change except the speakers and the team. Thank you very much. And then again, yeah. Okay, that's all right.
Yeah.
Next one.
Yeah, no, leave it. We can show tomorrow.
So I'll briefly, am I on? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I'll briefly address, and all of them not only are very pertinent questions, but these are the issues we need to continuously think about, because they're ever changing and the historical backgrounds are very curious given, what is going on. And starting with the last one, the Hindus wearing markers or the Sikhs wearing a turban, I think really came in the forefront in the Karnataka case, which was it 2 years ago, when they did not allow headscarved Muslim students in a particular college give exams, and that really blew up. And given that those students, female students, had been attending the college with their hijab for a few years, and so there was this huge constitutional debate that also came up at that time, which allowed religious groups to have markers. And so what was really going on? And in that whole debate, the level of discrimination and the sense of alienation definitely increased amongst the Muslim population, because as you say, Shailaja, the Hindu markers have also increased. The Christians wearing crosses around their neck has increased. And so where do the rest of those issues lie? And so since we grew up, and interestingly, with a lot of Hindu markers on women, like the sindoor, etc., I never questioned it and never saw it as a reflection of Hindutva, which the interpretation of these markers has shifted dramatically. When my grandmother would leave the house, she would loosely cover the head in the dupatta, not to claim an Islamic identity or to show Muslimness. Today, when the youngest generation is doing it, that is part of the agenda too. And also at that time, the Mangal Sutra or the Karas or the Bindis were their personal identities, maybe as Hindus, but as married women, it was multi-layered reasons, you know. That has also shifted. So it's a good point you bring up, that how it, both have become reactionary at some level to basically primarily claim their identity through these markers, you know, even though they can deny it, but it is becoming competing religious markers. And again, as I said earlier, women and women's bodies being used to claim the superiority of one religion over the other, which is controlled by patriarchy and men and all that stuff. To how to disentangle the international and national and who gets to wear the hijab. That is where maybe, to talk to your point, is some kind of uniformity is coming in. And I used to call what I refer to as the spread of Saudi Islam. And the subgroup is Salafi Islam. And I want to very, very briefly and very rapidly say is that is grounded, because in India, we did not have the head cover, the types we have now, or in America, or anywhere that we see, because I want to take it back very rapidly to the 1970s and 80s, where we saw the emergence of Islamic states, starting with the theological state of Iran, and then suddenly we saw Islamic State of Pakistan, the names changing, Islamic State of Bangladesh, of Indonesia, of Afghanistan, where I've done research for over a decade, because the dependency, the shift of dependency of these countries happened from the West, from the US, from the IMF, from the World Bank, to Saudi Arabia, which was willing to give foreign aid and all of that, as long as you changed your country's name, Islamicized, build mosques, and then in the name of zakat, forgive those loans. So the kind of economic dependencies that this created in that time, and because if you have a bird's eye view, you do see that there was all these things were happening in the early 80s. And so with that came this package deal of how to practice Islam. Because in India, historically, each region practiced it in their own ways. In 1981, when I came to the University of Chicago, my first project to collect some pennies to pay my rent was to do research for this professor in anthropology who was looking at goddesses, Bengali goddesses of diseases like Shitala and all for polio, for smallpox, which were in the homes of Bengali Muslims. So in Bengal, the Muslims still worshipped idols because they were so pertinent to their healthcare and everything else. In Tamil Nadu, they read the Quran in Tamil. I mean, they spoke the language, they ate the food. So India had a really diverse group of Muslims whose culture was regionally embedded. And as you point out now, is that we see that disappear. And the coming together definitely based through, because of social media, into a little more uniformity. And as you rightfully point out, who is dictating that? It is coming from the Middle East. It is coming from Saudi Arabia. And the best hijabs can be bought in Indonesia. And you know how capitalism, religion, and gender come together to create a patriarchy. Sorry to sound so feminist, but that is what I am. Is fascinating, you know. And so there is that's going on, and I think I'm done. Any other questions?
Yes, Umaji, now Dr. Rafat Hussain will moderate this question and answer session. And he is going to take over, and he is the one who will let others talk about it, ask questions. Rafat?
Thank you. Thank you, Razibhai. And so question and answer session is open now. So you can raise your digital hand or show your interest or put in the chat box your question and comment. And thank you to Professor Ahmed-Ghosh and Professor Shalija Sharma for wonderful talk. And you see there are a lot of compliments and comments,
Yeah.
but there is no question so far. So
two questions, Victor Beg and Syed Ahmed.
Okay, let me see.
Their hands are raised.
Yeah, so hands I am following. Okay. Ghalib Saab, please, Beg Saab, Ghalib Beg Saab. I ask you to unmute. Please go ahead. Okay, let's move to the end. Come back. Okay.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, adab, namaste. Thank you for calling me Ghalib Beg. Ghalib, Victor is actually a translation of Ghalib. Ghalib ne kaha, jaisa desh, waisa bhes. In America, no one could pronounce Ghalib, so I call me Victor. Anyways, I want to thank Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh. I am also an Algerian, also relating a person. I am also an interfaith. We had interfaith marriage. My wife came from a high-class Brahmin family. We were married for 50 years. And she just passed away recently.
Sorry.
So my question to you, how do you deal as an interfaith couple in today's Hindutva environment in India? Because that affected my wife a lot. She wore a hijab. We live in America, of course, and she accepted Islam. Before we got married, we had a private nikah, but civil ceremony because her parents came from Bombay to didn't want to offend them. Anyways, my question to you is, how do you deal in today's environment? Because it affected my wife a lot.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah. Firstly, condolences. Very sorry. 50 years is a very, very long time. I've just finished 40 and it feels forever.
Thank you.
But I'm sad that this is how she felt impacted. And I'm going to guess a few things here because I don't know why she felt, and I mean, she had her reasons, is just also, I'm just going to say something on the side, which is my observation living in the US, by the way, and it may not be your guys' personal experience, but I've been speaking up about some things amongst my friends. So it's not like giving a talk and then quickly switching off the computer and letting people stew in their own juices. So amongst my friends, that when I'm with my non-Muslim friends, who are 99%, majority of them are, somehow a discussion moves to caste. And it's very interesting because it gets triggered or started by Brahmins, who will somehow in the conversation say, even though I'm a Brahmin, I do not believe in caste system. Or like recently a friend is, I think some of them are on the thing, I'm not going to bring it up, but is that, and then the second or third in the caste will try to show that how they are maybe highly educated and so therefore some caste privilege or whatever. And I stop them from talking about it because I say, why is it that when a bunch of Hindus get together, they feel the need, especially the higher caste, to mention it. And then jokingly, I will always say to them that, well, I'm a Chamar convert, so when you go home, you may, have to purify yourself, because it really bothers me they do that all the time. So I don't know if your wife had internalized through her upbringing and her community a sense of Brahmanism that got totally defiled by her marrying a Muslim. I mean, this is just and so it bothered her. And I don't know to what extent her family accepted you or her marriage. So that was one unfortunate thing, which I did not have to experience much because my husband's not a Brahmin, but also because neither converted. And also we came, even though after I moved to San Diego 40 years ago, amongst my Gujarati and other friends, there was this gossip that I had converted him, but neither converted, and both came from very, very secular backgrounds. So we had a civil wedding. We did the rituals of, henna and this and that, but we had a civil wedding. So I think the level of consciousness of not making it interreligious to that extent prevented any kind of discomfort. We got beat up for it initially because, again, very quickly say that when we got married in 1984 in India, because we chose to have a civil marriage in the courts, in 30 Hazari courts in Delhi, we had to put up the notice in the courts for a month. And that month gives apparently both communities and others to check out if it's a legitimate marriage or an abduction. And so we got married, and my husband came back to the US. I stayed on to finish my field research. And his aunt, who's Bengali Hindu, is what they are. Her address was given in Delhi, and a very kindly old, well-dressed man arrived at her house a week after we got married, or 2 weeks later, and said, "Are you so and so? And we heard that your son married a non-Hindu, and did she convert, by the way, through Arya Samaj?" And she said, "No, and who are you?" And he said, "VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which has a big center in Los Angeles." And so then she got a little nervous and said, "He's not my son," which he isn't. And so told him to leave the house. But a month later, they tracked down my husband in New York City, and he got a call early in the morning on a weekend with a person talking in a very familiar tone in Bengali and saying to him, "Oh, you must have forgotten your Bengali, this, that, and the other. But we heard you married a Muslim woman, and we have a place in New York where you can take her for conversion," and this and that. And he lost it, and he just slammed the phone down. And then for many, many years, and I want to say today on this, on today's my talk, he's there. I saw the name. And this, we are talking 40 years, okay, guys, here, he's there. He would write in the India Abroad. There would always be a column which would be about anti-Nehru, at that time, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and intermarriages. And once I got an email, and it scared me, and I went to my university and had it removed forever and all of that stuff. So we had those kinds of incidents happen to us, but nothing serious. And between the two of us, I think none, and between our families, none, because I think our families were just very different. And one or two relatives on my husband's side tried to raise an issue, and my father-in-law said there's no need to come to the wedding, and they all showed up here because nobody wants to miss a party. So I was much, much respected and loved by my in-laws, and continue to be by my husband's family. Sometimes to tease him, I say they love me more than you, because there was a secularish India at one point, And if we can respect each other, I respected my in-laws. I had no issues. My parents did, my husband did. We had no issues on that kind of stuff. But we get called upon to talk about our experiences, even till last week, because love jihad became such a big thing. Yeah. And our children have no faith.
So you asked a question quickly, that what bothered her. It's because she was in a chat group, WhatsApp, with her friends from Bombay and all that. She said the kind of stuff they're putting on.
Yeah, yeah.
She was very popular in school and loved by everyone. To see all that stuff.
It's very disturbing. Very, very disturbing. I have got off all the WhatsApp groups, which were my high school friends, boarding school friends, college friends. I just don't need to interact with those people.
Our families have been great together. The only thing my father-in-law questioned, he was the deputy commissioner of police, actually, at that time in Bombay, that make sure he doesn't have 3 more wives.
Yeah.
I know
it doesn't stop. I know.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're so right. I still today hear such bizarre, archaic things from people I considered friends. It's interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, that's true. So, Amir Saab.
Thank you. I wonder, Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh, that what we are witnessing today in the trend in the world, do you think these are periodic waves we see or witness over at least a century? Because if I could give the example after the First World War, Mustafa Kemal Pasha in Turkey secularized the society and outlawed the burqa, chadar, whatever it was in Turkey. And similarly in Iran at the time, the king, he also secularized Iranian society and forced women not to, made it unlawful to wear chadar. In Afghanistan, probably a little earlier, Amanullah Shah, King Amanullah Shah instituted same kind of reforms, but it was a severe reaction against them. Now, I think what we see now, to my mind, seems to date back to the Islamic revolution in Iran, Khomeini revolution. These seem to have started a trend. Now, I think very rightly you say, and you made a very nice survey, that Saudi Arabia has triggered or fueled a lot of these changes. But do you think there is a competition between the Iranian revolution and the Saudi, and both trying to get the influence earn the influence among the Muslim countries? Although it seemed lately that Saudi Arab seemed to be coming to the different direction under the new prince, Salman, and liberalizing the society. So coming back, the question is, do you think this is the permanent trend, or we are just seeing the post-colonial kind of reaction and it will go back again? And these are periodic changes. Thank you.
Yeah, good question, because I mean, at some level, I'm very hopeful. I'm a very optimistic person. And so I hope it is the flavor of the season and it will change. And at another level, it has always been there under the surface, starting from the Crusades, if you really want to go all the way back, you know, and it has peaked now. And this has to do with both sides. Because, and as I said earlier, with the Saudi influence and the controlling of trying to create a universal Islam, also is tied into the money they have. And that's being used very effectively. So it is a combination of all of this. To put it in one sentence, I just want to say it's a phase. And I do hope that there will be some petering out of the extremities and the extreme politics that we are seeing. And I want to put it in the same category of the swing towards the right wing, because like with Trump coming in and the extreme, not coming in, my optimism, he's not coming in, but how he appeals and what he appeals to the masses is not necessarily nothing to do with Islam, but a kind of mindset. And so this Islamophobia is one part of that kind of right-wing mindset. But of course, unfortunately, I hope it doesn't then lead to another community experiencing this kind of hate, because, you know, as they said, this German philosopher decades ago, you know, when they came for so-and-so, I wasn't there for them. And then it goes on. And when they came for me, there was nobody to stand for me. So I think transference of this kind of oppression will always exist. How long it will be for Muslims, I don't know. And I want to say that this is the first time I've seen some kind of thinking on the part of the youth when it comes to maybe Islam and Muslims being triggered by the Israel-Palestine situation. Because through my friends and their children, I try to find out what's going on TikTok, and the kind of violence that is being perpetrated there has turned off a lot of young people who don't want wars and who don't want violence. And this region is bringing a new awareness of who Muslims are, what Muslims are. And I'm hoping maybe, in my optimistic way, be something that could change the image of the perceived image of Islam that the West has tried to propagate since the Crusades. Yeah, I think
Thank
it is
you.
temporary. And the recent election was a little hopeful also in India in terms of, you know.
Thank you both, Professor Ghosh and Dr. Amir. The next is Nazima. Please go ahead. I ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And, you know, these insights are really, really helpful to understand what is happening today. And as a Muslim woman, I also wonder that we really fought against dupatta and burqa and everything. And now when I see young girls, so these are some of the questions which are really important to understand. So my question is, I would like to, and you rightly answered that question about the competing religiosity, that how religiosity, this kind of religiosity is actually across communities, is not confined or limited to Muslim. But a part of the question is that, I would like to just mention here that, and you have been working on this issue, that this category of Muslim women is a discursively constituted category, which has a global, a colonial, and a national history. And in that, the hijab and burqa has played a very, very important role. I mean, in objectifying Muslim women's identity as submissive, as having no agency of her own, and things like that. So I would like to, and some of my observations on this issue were also that, while speaking to these girls, that for some of them, this was a kind of liberating gesture, because they get some kind of, they negotiate their education, they can negotiate their employment to work in men-only environment as well, because they are adopting to this kind of Islamic, practice from their families and things like that. So how do you look at these kind of negotiations, specifically in terms of agency? So this is one of my questions. And the other question is, it's not a question, but whether we want or not, and we like or not, but we eventually reduce Muslim women's identity on burqa and hijab. I mean, this is a research, limitations of the research as well. But it does not stop there on the hijab only, because now there are these categories about Muslim feminists as well, that there are Islamic feminists and Muslim feminism and these kind of things, where already the religious kind of symbolisms have always been used in Indian mainstream feminist movements as well. So when it comes to Muslim women's identity, how certain things or certain issues become like a marker of their identity, to actually objectify them in variety of ways, in secular ways, in communal ways.
What is your question?
So I just would like to know your reflection on these issues. So thank you.
So I did answer a lot of that in my talk. And, so theoretically, a lot of this has been analyzed, discussed, and written about, what you are mentioning. And you're very right in these observations that you are making. And of course, as I mentioned, the 7-8 points of why they were covering their heads, it's their perception of liberation, which is to be respected, and all of that. I still have some issues with the term Islamic feminism. I'm not going to say that it's totally an oxymoron, because very good work has been done, and I do respect people who are so-called religious. It's its exclusionary perspective and its discriminatory aspects that I object to when it comes to religion and religious texts. And I also do not believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because, if there's something that I perceive as negative or oppressive in Islam, I speak about it to my students, because I don't see the need to be defensive, because Islam is more than so-called 4 wives or giving the permission to beat your wife or whatever. And also one has to look at these religions within its historical context, and of course, patriarchy. So I think with Islamic feminism, my issue to some extent, not entirely, is that it is looking to still justify certain things in the religion that need structural changes in the lived realities of people. So to use it as a base, especially in secular societies, to create like a personal law or family law, I find problematic. I want Islamic feminism to go a further step, to contest a lot of things that are discriminatory gender-wise. in a religion, but I still see it as the first step by these brilliant scholars to question or reinterpret what seems problematic. And in that, with that understanding, many women choose to cover their heads and claim an empowerment and a liberation and an ability to engage in the public spaces, and more power to them. There is no doubt. Yes, it's always comes down to covering, to clothing. And as I said earlier, I don't know how to decenter from that when we talk about Muslim women, because I would like to, because these same women that we're talking about here know that their identity is multi-layered and they're more than the headscarf. But I think it's just the very visibility of it that has created the various global debates historically, and at another level, very problematic, because then it gets used in ways to really put down a whole community, or for the fundamentalist Muslims to claim a superiority because we cover our women. So on both sides, I find it problematic. Yes, for the woman herself, she may be choosing it for her good reasons, but how she gets used is where I have the problem. And so just finished with a third reader of Islam, the rise of women's groups in fundamentalist Islamic groups in Kerala, and how they appropriate feminist jargon. But the central committee that's telling these women's groups within these mosques and Tablighi groups, they're all men. So there is a certain level of empowerment Muslim women are experiencing, especially in the working and lower classes, which I read about and saw for the first time when I edited the books that I did now 5 years, 10 years ago, whenever, from other parts of Asia, Indonesia, from Thailand and all, that they get picked up to become religious transmitters, and they are allowed to go house to talk about Islam. That mobility in itself is empowering, at some level, and cannot be taken away from them, So these are dilemmas. This is the mixed bag. But who is
No, of course.
ultimately controlling all of this is what I'm questioning. It's not the sense of empowerment the women are feeling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Same is the case with All India Muslim Personal Law Board membership.
Exactly.
So I completely understand.
Exactly.
Thank
Oh
you.
my God. Yeah, let's not go there.
Thank you. Thank you both. Dr. Nazir Ahmed.
Thank you, Rafa. A very illuminating presentation, comprehensive,
Thank you.
about Muslim women's identity, defining it in the context of the interplay between religion, history, and culture. It seems to me the constraints that have emerged in this definition, some of them were by choice and some were imposed. For instance, even going back to the pre-partition era, the Muslims chose to define themselves as a minority, even though they were a majority in Bengal and in Punjab and some of the other areas. Then came Hindutva, and that was imposed. There was Mullahism. It has always been with us, especially in the Indian context, that is cultural. And then there is the gender dialectic between Muslim men and Muslim women in the context of the so-called personal law, which itself is very culture bound and history bound. My question is twofold. One, if we look at the historical spectrum of events in the last 80 years or so, who, in your opinion, are role models that our young Muslim Indian women can use and imbibe? That would be one. And the second one would be, considering the technological transformations, as you rightly pointed out. What advice would you give the young Muslim women of today? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you put me on the spot here because I am their grandmother's generation, just by the way. So advice is never listened to by people this old.
Dr. Huma, I'm 85 years old, so that should put you at rest.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. I think, again, coming back to I agree with everything you said, because pre-partition, I mean, the Muslim League had their own agenda too, and we had great stalwarts and poets and politicians and very, very, I'm going to say something really dangerous here, almost Hindutva-oriented leaders in the country just before partition, who also deliberately sidelined very secular Muslim leaders. That said, I will move on, which gave fodder to the Muslim League and others to want to separate, which partition something I did not approve of. They didn't ask me, I wasn't born at that time. But similarly, yes, you're right about Hindutva also, because they want a Hindu nation. The others wanted a Muslim nation. In the modern era, we are not used to it because we've had about 75 years of secularism. For the young Muslims, yeah, I really am at a loss of who their role models would be per se within India. Only because of aging, I'm blanking out with names. But there are many role models, I believe, whose writings are very popular on TikTok, on social messaging, media messaging. And more, I think a shift is role models coming from outside India for the youth. And I will tell you, just from my very limited experience about role models for young people, is that when I talked about issues of sexuality, which, by the way, these people brought it up themselves, about LGBT issues and all that, which their parents, grandparents never want to talk about. They talked about Muslim LGBT groups in England and the US that they sought advice from and identified with, and mentioned Muslim gay comedians, politicians, Muslim gay entertainers mainly, who were their role models, who were of South Asian origin, but living in the West. So there's definitely a shift in looking for role models globally. Advice-wise, being an academic, I do want them to be more knowledgeable and read more on the historicity of this situation. I find that with my American students in the US also, they're not, because of a lack of understanding of a history of how their identity is what it is today, it limits their negotiation with the larger society. Because it's not today, it wasn't just, 9/11 didn't just happen out of nothing, or Babri Masjid did not happen out of nothing. So the individualizing of a perception of their identity can be limiting to some extent, and trying to understand their cultural background, the historicity, and then the political manipulation of them and their community, and the political manipulation on both sides. They need to be aware of that. And I think they are held hostage many times, unbeknownst to them, when they feel that because the Muslim community has a besieged mentality now in India, they need to be defensive or support the larger Islamic wave in India to counter Hindutvism. They need to be more savvy and sophisticated about understanding their location by deconstructing some of these kinds of rhetoric that has taken over on both sides. This is the generation that will bring the change. We tried and we failed.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. I don't see any raised hand or the chat box. So let me ask a question before I pass over to Dr. Raziuddin. So I come from Aligarh and I spent almost all of my adult life at AMU. And there are many colleagues who are in the audience and they can verify that. So in our time in 1970s or 80s, we had at least not seen the hijab among those educated girls. Now, there were some burqas, of course, but very few burqas. So now, almost all of these educated girls wear hijab. I would say more than 90%. And there is a sea change in their outfit. So my question is this cultural? Is this religious? Is there an identity crisis? Or is it an after effect of 9/11? That's what we see that it. I know you have touched a lot of points there. It cannot be Hindutva because Hindutva is 2014 and it began after 9/11. So I know you touched some of the point, and one more question, is it the girls who are wearing hijab are more pious now?
Then non-hijab. Okay, good question.
So that's all. Thank you.
Okay. So I think it's a combination of everything that you mentioned. And this is where I talk, when I use the word complex, it's basically to summarize everything that you said, because it's a combination of a lot of things. Though I would say 1992, maybe the Babri Masjid did start triggering the need to be Islamic and covering. Like if I found that there were young women, if they were not wearing the hijab in visible ways, they were wearing full sleeves and they were not wearing Western dress. So that dress thing was starting to creep in. You're right, when we are the same generation and we did not see it. And it's not just Hindutva, no, not at all. But I also do want to say that Hindutva didn't start when you said it did. It started pre-partition with the RSS. They had a 100-year agenda and man, they succeeded big time. So those rumblings were always there. And just to add a little tangent is, unfortunately for the Muslims, given that I'm a congressee, is that they also looked at and decided issues about Muslims by talking more to the clergy than to the secular Muslims. And so the animosity was creeping in because the way Muslims in India were being perceived by Hindus and by politicians were in ways which we see culminate then during BJP and all of that, etc. But at the point which I find very interesting that you bring up about are they more religious, I want to say I don't know at some level. Secondly, I want to say that I do find it problematic that they think they are more religious than non-hijabi Muslims. And this is, I think, a worldwide phenomena, because then once you start adopting the rituals and all of that of a religion, you think you become the spokesperson. And this is an interesting point again, because this was very visible when I talked to the Muslim non-hijabis and the Muslim hijabis, given that so many hijabis could not point out to me where in the Quran or the Hadith it says you should cover yourself and cover yourself that way. So I think one has to understand that there is a difference in being a spiritually Muslim Islamic person and how some people politicize Islam to claim that they are the representatives of Islam. And I want to say that the recent headscarving that you're seeing, which has been happening over the last 20, 25 years, is definitely rooted in a politicization of Islam within the community, the nation, and their personal lives. It cannot be removed from that. And this is where I also briefly said there was a generational shift in how we cover ourselves, because when my grandmother would cover her head to leave the house, it was not the politicization reasons.
It was a respect.
Yeah, it was respect and all. So though they use the rhetoric, the young generation, of respect and this and that, but it is the global politicization of Islam, of the mullahs, the politicization by the mullahs. I know I'm sounding like so terrible, but I'm not bashing them. I see them as political puppets, as I see Modi or anybody else, frankly, who are then legitimizing it and telling them that this is a way of empowering yourself, but they're really empowering themselves and their interpretation of the faith. And it's a sorority at some level, and I'm really getting myself into trouble when I see it in San Diego State University. But the need to have a community is stronger now for these young people than it was for us. And because of global politics and everything else, this is a more obvious way to do it than not. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Madam Aisha, please.
It's always a pleasure to listen to you, Professor Huma-Ghosh. You may not remember me, but we have met in AMU maybe a few years ago before COVID.
Oh, wow.
You partially, yes. Let me ask you a question. You partially answered my question, which I had in your previous response. Here, I remember you had used a sentence. I hope I'm not wrong. The sentence was that you mentioned socialism and then you said that it's not something to be scared of. From there, I would say you have, though, hinted upon this, but still, I would like you to say it explicitly. How do you situate this move towards political Islam and then the identity politics among Muslim women, young Muslim women? How do you relate it with this post-Cold War scenario in the world? We have seen that the world has moved from the left to the right, and what we see, when we see the influence of Saudi Arabia and its culture, how it's changing though, on South Asia, as Muslim women in South Asia start to adopt, as they started wearing abayas during the 90s and 2000, in the new millennium, we know that at the same time, we know that it's some kind of indirectly they're following the empire, basically. So it's a very ironic situation that some kind of Western influence that we would like to stay away from would indirectly come to us. Capitalism reaches us either way, either without scarf or with scarf, without hijab or with hijab. Either way, it comes to us. And I would like to quote Kanta Ahmed, though she is now supposedly a Zionist, but still, I read her memoir. She says that Saudi Arabia is nothing but USA with Arabic subtitles. Kanta Ahmed, yeah, her memoir is In the Land of Invisible Women. Would you say something about this? Thank you so much.
Okay, sweetheart, you've asked me to say a lot and think a lot. But before I take off, Aisha, wonderful to hear your voice. Please email me. I'd like to be in touch with you. Yeah, so
Thank you.
what I'm gathering from what you're saying is the many layers of complexity that really exist. And as the previous speaker also said, that, what is the one reason for wearing the hijab for women? There's no one reason for anything. But what your question did is, if I got it right, is add another layer, which is very important today, which is the role of capitalism and westernization and the close relationship between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel today, We have to recognize that nexus for what's going on at the socialization level, at the cultural level, and at the capitalism level. And so I love this. It's amazing, the framework that you're putting out there, because then it makes us all pawns to this larger system in different ways. I mean, just by living in the US, I'm a pawn of this nexus, which is so corrupt, so violent, and so hate-filled, you know. And as somebody just said, what is the advice you would give? This is something which is maybe the younger generation need to realize and see what their location is in this larger framework and to what extent they are enabling this system. And like one of the very simplistic examples I would say from my research was that the whole attitudes towards the hijab for the younger generation were very interesting. And so much of it had to do more with consumerism and other factors. Like I called them a sorority for a reason. Then really the deep religious ideology that they did not really understand. And I want to continue putting myself on the hit list that even in San Diego, with the arrival of the new mosque and the level of so-called Islamization, I am finding that the understanding of Islamic values do not exist to the extent that the women are involved in covering themselves, following fashions, hosting parties, etc. And this last Eid was quite problematic for me because every day was a iftar party. They stopped volunteering in the group, the thing that I have started, because they had to make kebabs. So sometimes I feel like, are you the true Muslim or is it me? And what was this whole month of Ramadan was exactly what you're saying, Aisha, was catering to the highest level of capitalism they could. And when it comes to donations to the Palestine, zero commitment. So I have my own personal problematics with some of the so-called newly emerging Islamic women. But for the younger generation, I would like to see you and your writing come out, connecting our identities, our existence to the bigger picture. It's very important to understand who we are, what we represent, and what we are meant to represent. And ultimately, which I talk to everybody about, is question the concept of choice. It's not a choice. What most of them are doing is an excuse for personal ends, because that's very problematic. Do the same women who choose to cover their heads protest the women in Afghanistan who are, the Afghanistan government who forced the women to cover their heads? Do we ever see any protest by them? So choice itself is problematic. And as you have pointed out, we are part of a nexus that is Western, capitalism oriented. I don't want to say anymore because I'll really get into trouble. Yeah. Because the
Thank you so much.
situation in the Middle East is disturbing beyond words. It's disturbing beyond words because it is finally showing us where the rest of the world stands and what is going on and where we as individuals fit into this paradigm.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. It was wonderful. Before now, I pass on to Dr. Raziuddin. Oh, sorry, I have to show you the picture first. For next photo. Okay, Razi bhai. Razi bhai. Dr. Raziuddin.
Thank you. Well, here's coming Saturday's talk. And, talk was partly on the feminism, Muslim feminism. This is one breaking the glass ceiling in 100 years of AMU's history. Professor Naima Khatun, first Vice Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University. She is going to talk on coming Saturday. So just take off this. And now I too have one question and then we are done because it is 2 hours. Regarding this hijab, I mean, I don't think this is a homogeneous scenario. I can give you an example. A lot of very active feminist girls in New York and elsewhere deliberately do wear hijab because they say that it is their right just for identity to show them that we are Muslim. And though most of them are hardly practicing Muslim, they are really very highly accomplished, very liberal, but some of them do. My daughter lives in Brooklyn, and she tells me, and she's hyper active in the group of Palestinians or world community of Muslim girls. Almost all are highly accomplished there, and half of them are wearing hijab, and none of them are practicing actually. But they claim it as a matter. This is an identity thing. So partly, I think this hijab in India, just like here, it just came part of them, partly maybe conservative side, partly religious side, and partly as a reaction for identity. I have seen a lot in Bombay, Mumbai, and Tamil Nadu, like Chennai and other places where hardly you have seen hijab or beard. Now it is filled with that. Maybe there they are more religious, but here in New York or Los Angeles and other places, this is a situation. And they are very secular, very feminist, very liberal.
Oh, yes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's for sure. There is always that. And I see them here, they're working with me. They're, and that's what we've been trying to say when we talk of the complexity is it definitely, irrespective of anything else, is an identity marker. It definitely is an identity marker, but why younger women are choosing to wear it more and more differs. The reasons are very different. And the problematics are in how they are being perceived, and therefore how is the community being judged. To put it very simplistic, that, and of course, they're all in medical school, engineering, this, that, everything is happening. One is not denying that. But again, it comes down to what is your identity? Is it who you think you are, or is it how you are perceived by others?
Exactly.
And that is where I want to rest my case, because in the 67, like the last 40 years of my life, I have found myself being perceived so differently from who I have thought I am, and being called upon to be to explain myself. It's like, stop, I'm just a floating human being trying to mind my own business. But why is it even today in San Diego, including last night when I had people over for dinner, ultimately the discussion moved to the discrimination of Muslims and personal experiences in India. And I tell my friends, if in your group there was not a Muslim that evening, would you be talking about it? Why is there on your part the need to let me know that you are an ally of Muslims, you are anti-Modi? Why is there a need on your part? Because you perceive me in certain ways. And this part of my life will be till I die, because I hear there's Islamophobia, India is Hindu-Muslim. मगर मुझे ये सब नहीं चाहिए. I don't want any of it,
One of the very...
So I wanted to add here, because it is often said this is their right to have the hijab. And of course, they had that right all over since the Islam came in existence. Why do they exert that right now? Is that a reaction? We have already talked about that.
We've talked about it.
Yeah. So anyway, Nidhi raised hand, and Nidhi wants to ask question, and then that would be the last question.
Thank you. It's a wonderful lecture, madam. Thank you. मैं एक सवाल पूछना चाहती हूँ कि मैं एक नॉन गवर्नमेंट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन की फाउंडर हूँ, और हमारे यहाँ जितनी मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी की महिलाएं जब हिजाब पहन के आती हैं, तब मैं उनसे एक साधारण सा सवाल करती हूँ कि आप ये क्यों पहनती हो और क्या जरूरत है इसको पहनने की। 45 से 50 डिग्री टेम्परेचर गर्मी होती है, तब वो कहते नहीं मैडम हमारे धर्म में लिखा है। तो मैं बड़ी निरुत्तर सी हो जाती हूँ उस समय पे कि तो क्योंकि मैं सवाल इसलिए पूछ रही हूँ और जानना भी चाहती हूँ मेरे नॉलेज को बढ़ाने के लिए कि उस समय पे मैं क्या जवाब दूं। और चूंकि हमारे जैसे लोग जो ग्राउंड लेवल पे काम करते हैं, तो राइटिंग, आई एम ऑल्सो एन एकेडमिशियन, बट द प्रॉब्लम इज कि हम जब लोग ग्राउंड लेवल पे काम करते हैं तो हम लोगों को उन लोगों को कन्विंस करने के लिए किस तरीके के सवालों के जवाब देने चाहिए और उन्हें समझाना चाहिए कि ये आपकी चॉइस है, पर हाउ टू कन्विंस देम, दैट इज द प्रॉब्लम।
No, I'm glad you brought up this question. Do you want me to speak in English, Hindi, both? I would prefer both, but I'm glad you brought up this question because जैसे आपने the previous person said कि उनकी बेटी ब्रुकलिन में है. I do want to bring your question resonated with me because also we cannot deny class privilege, okay? Which classes are privileged and can afford to make themselves the markers of the faith? Because ये लोग सब पढ़े लिखे हैं and they're smart and they are empowered and they're creating a space and they can do that. In many countries and many other social classes, it's very difficult because you get seen as the enemy and then pay for it. And जैसे आप कह रही हैं कि ये आपकी NGO में आती हैं, you're very right. Because these women, forget the heat. I was in Afghanistan at 55 and they were wearing blue polyester burqas, is that for them, I would want to say maybe they're expressing some agency. They can get out of the house in it. They feel that they're contributing in their social class. They're empowered to some extent because they don't have jobs. They don't have other markers of empowerment. Coming out and interacting with non-Muslims. So yes, I think whatever you're doing and asking them, which is a very good question, कि इतनी गर्मी में आप ये सब पहन रही हैं, and they may not have answers that are rooted in the religious texts, because at that level it's all customary laws and stories and what is passed down. And recognizing the need to want to wear it would be something that if you found ways of expressing it, they would really at some level empower them rather than make them defensive. कि हाँ, क्योंकि हम लोग को पता है कि ग्राउंड लेवल पे और हर लेवल पे कैसे बात अपनी एक्सप्रेस कर सकते हैं through making it light-hearted. कि इतनी गर्मी में आप पहन के आई हैं, we really appreciate it, that you are here, at least you are here, coming for the services. Because in that social class, by the way, Sylvia Vatuk's work is very, very informative about how the working class women in Hyderabad did not want to do away with triple talaq. It's fascinating how across class women have different kinds of perspectives on things. And for the working class and the lower classes in India and in Afghanistan, I saw that the burqa was used to diffuse class differences because of clothing, etc. And I think for your staff to get an education in gender and Islam and some of the basic tenets is important. Not to say that, not that they should agree or justify or legitimize any of it if they don't want to, but to understand where the women are coming. It doesn't sometimes justify the action, but an understanding of their community, where they're coming from, where their dependencies lie, especially economically, and the kind of patriarchy that's being exercised in their community. Just an understanding of it helps to also interact with these people, and for them to know that you know about their religion and community, even that little step is empowering for them.
जी हुमा जी, ऐसा है कि बहुत आप थक गई होंगी, लेकिन
थैंक यू सो मच।
एक साहब बहुत लेट जो है जगे हैं, तो उनका क्वेश्चन भी सुन लीजिए। काफी सीनियर आदमी हैं।
हाँ जरूर।
रजाउल्लाह कुरैशी साहब। तो रजाउल्लाह कुरैशी साहब, आप जरा बहुत शार्ट होंगे बहुत क्विकली क्वेश्चन करें, और उम्मीद है कि बहुत ज्यादा जाहिर है कि इस्लामी पे होगा, तो आप तैयार रहिए हुमा जी, वो आपको अभी
गो एट
रेड हैंड पकड़ने वाले रजौला साहब।
जी शुक्रिया रजी भाई। पहले तो मैं ये कह दूं कि हाँ, मेरे भी 3 जनरेशन है, और 3rd जनरेशन में भी हिजाब वो एज की लड़कियां हैं और कुछ करती भी हैं। मैं भी मिड 80s में हूँ अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह, लेकिन मेरी बेटियां और ये तमाम, अच्छा जो पर्सपेक्टिव बहन ने दिया है, हुमा बहन ने, वो बहुत जबरदस्त, वेरी वेल रिसर्च्ड एंड बहुत अच्छा उन्होंने प्रेजेंटेशन दिया, और पूरा डिस्कशन बहुत अच्छा रहा। मैं सिर्फ ये कहना चाहूंगा कि इसमें एक एस्पेक्ट तो ये है, जैसे ये भी आया कि कुछ लोग, सम पीपल डू इट जस्ट बिकॉज दे वांट टू लुक whatever fashion and all. Oh yeah, there are all perspectives, obviously, but my observation is, my wife, she's religious, practicing, and we've been married 55 some years, I think.
MashaAllah.
But she has never worn even covered hair. सिर्फ नमाज में इधर उधर तो ठीक है, otherwise she doesn't. But among the children, one wears other than, and so on. Now, what I want to say is that this should be the choice. Many countries, when Turkey started about 20 some years back, and I raised the question to the ex-minister, bhai, kisi ko force mat kijiye, but then if somebody wants to do it, within Islam, there is 90% people think that it is needed, although I have studied, and I am of the opinion it's an open question, Quran ke mutabik. So the hadith that people quote has a weakness and so on. So what I'm saying is, if those people, yes, modesty is one thing that's very important. And a lot of that has to do with the culture. So Indian culture, Indian Pakistani culture. मैंने राजस्थान में जब टूर किया आज से कोई 12-13 साल पहले।
आपका सवाल क्या है?
भाई आप लंबा खींचे,
मैं तो जनरल कमेंट कर रहा हूँ। तो मेरा सिर्फ कमेंट ये है कि we should take it as it is and not make it a big issue. और दूसरी ये hijab term itself, I have a problem with that. So yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the time.
मैं सवाल समझ रही हूँ, मगर the bottomest line of this whole discussion is who defines modesty and who defines modesty for whom.
Yes.
और उसकी एक सब कैटेगरी हिजाब है and everything else. So I would like to end on the note that what is modesty?
Thank you, Professor Ghosh, again, and for the audience to stay with us more than 2 hours, actually, close to 2.5 hours, and keeping the discussion alive. So thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.